Today we're going to learn about Martin Harris. The photograph you see, of course, is doctored up. There's only one photograph we have of Martin, and it was taken when he was not quite 90 years old. I don't know if any of us would like to have the one photograph taken of us in our later years, but so it is for Martin. You'll notice he had what was called a chin beard. We see lots of men today with different types of beard, but I haven't seen this particular one that was in fashion during his time. Today we're going to learn about Martin Harris, and you'll see me coming back and back again to the prophet Joseph as I tell his story. Well, as we begin, we know that the Martin Harris family had their early beginnings. We can trace them back to British shores. We know that they came on boats to America. In fact, Thomas Harris, who is an ancestor of Dallin H. Oaks, came on the very same boat to America with a man named Roger Williams. And what I think is so interesting is that Roger Williams is the direct ancestor of Jeffrey R. Holland. So you get two men in leading councils of the church today can both trace their ancestors as one friends and coming at the same time to the United States. Now, for a while, as we focus on the Harris family, they stayed in the Boston area in Massachusetts. Eventually, they moved up to Rhode Island. And while they're in Providence, Rhode Island, they earned a living by acquiring land, basically squatters' rights. They had seen themselves becoming farmers, but it turned out the rock on their land made them more profit than did any kind of crops they would grow. So as a result, there were several quarries on the Harris property in Rhode Island, and wouldn't you know it, it was such a success that Generation 1 stayed there, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth. You'd say the very first of the Harris family to move out of Providence, Rhode Island, will be Nathan Harris and his brother Rufus. Now, Nathan Harris ultimately becomes the father of Martin. While they had been in Rhode Island, the Harris family became Quakers as it relates to their religious faith. They kept their faith but quit Rhode Island. They went from Rhode Island to eventually parts of New York, and finally there was a big cry to open up Western New York. When rumors were going out that Western New York would be the new green pastures, and there was talk of an Erie Canal. Among those that decided to move to a place called Swift's Landing was Nathan Harris. Now, Swift's Landing along the proposed Erie Canal was named for John Swift. Today we know it as Palmyra. As Nathan Harris comes in town, not only does he have family members listed as well as his wife and his brother and his family, but he also has money in his pockets. He has enough to buy out 600 acres, most of it located on what is called Winter Green Hill. Now, for Nathan Harris, the father, he was active in civic affairs, but you'd say the affairs weren't much that he was involved in. He was more fun than he wanted to give a lot of service to his community. So you'd say Nathan was a hunter, he was a fisher. You'd say for him he served as a, quote, pathfinder, which meant he literally kept the path leading up to his home there on Winter Green Hill, free from weeds and so forth. He was seen at barn raisings, and as time went on, you'd say that Martin is now growing up to manhood in Palmyra. The difference between Martin and his father was Martin was really organized and responsible. It wasn't long until Nathan Harris realized that Martin could do more than just work in the fields or work on a loom with weaving or other opportunities that were available for young and then the youth. For Martin, we have no record of his going to school, but obviously he could read and write, and Martin, before long, will now take over his father's properties as what we would today call a general manager. Now, for Martin, by the time he's 25 years old, he is a most eligible bachelor in Palmyra. He's got money in his pockets. He manages Dad's vast estate, which is 600 acres at a time. If you could acquire 100 acres, you wouldn't have to have a second job. So Martin's well on his way to becoming one of the up-and-coming rising young men in Palmyra. As a bachelor, the question was, who would he marry? Growing up in Martin's home will actually be his first cousin, Lucy. Notice there is an age gap between the two of about 9 years or so, and when Martin is age 25, he marries his first cousin, Lucy Harris. So perhaps we could call her Lucy Harris Harris. For Lucy, she was reported to be a beautiful young woman. She, like Martin, were very active in the Quaker Society. In fact, by the time of their marriage, we can identify 45 families that have moved to Swift's Landing / Palmyra, and these families are all Quakers. So there's quite a contingency of Quakers in Palmyra with, it's a large branch where many of them then have associations with a larger group of Quakers a few miles away in Farmington. It is assumed that Martin and Lucy were married in the Quaker church. They became the parents of 6 children. If you were to say, how was Martin doing as time passed, and he's a husband, a father, and continuing to take care of his father's estate, people in Palmyra were saying of Martin, none were more promising. Now, as you see him as becoming more well-to-do and fitting in with not just the Quaker community, but also with Western Presbyterians, who were by far the most kind of high-end and upcoming young men in Palmyra, we get now the War of 1812. The United States has declared war on Great Britain, and where much of the fighting will occur will be along the Canadian border. Every man in Palmyra from the ages of 18 to 45 was called to colors, meaning they were asked to enlist, and John Swift, actually the founder of what we know of as Palmyra, was going to lead these men into combat. Now, at that time, you could enlist, and everyone was required to do so. That was a man 18 to 45. But if you had means, you could hire a substitute to take your place. How can we prove that Martin was literally one of the young men of more promise as it relates to wealth? Martin hired a man and then another one to take his place in the War of 1812. As for himself, we know of no time that he fought in any battles during the war. We know that he himself personally had 9 days in service in the War of 1812, but hardly enough to qualify for some kind of pension for his military service. When it came to Martin, business rated high, but coming into a close second for him were revivals that came in the Palmyra area in 1818. Apparently at that time, people in the East became very concerned that so many people had moved out to Western New York, and they had moved out without taking their preachers. And so in the East, they decided, we've got to send men out to try and save our country from becoming a heathen country there in Western New York. And so you get ministers coming out from the east along the proposed Erie Canal. These ministers began to hold revival meetings outside of the small little communities. For Martin Harris, he was a big attender at revivals where they were saying, "Hallelujah, brother, I've been saved, have you?" And so we can find Martin from 1818 through the early part of the 1820s. We can find him in attendance at 6 different churches. So if you're looking for who is a seeker after truth, it's Martin Harris. What causes this great interest in him to search for religion? And for Martin, he claimed that he had what was called a theophany, in which he had learned that the true church was not upon the earth, but would soon be. So we find him attending the Quakers along with his wife, Lucy, remember his first cousin and wife. We find him with the Universalists, with a group called the Restorationers, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, and also the Methodists. Now, while he is doing this, Martin is also very busy. And you get the idea, a busy man, he has lots of responsibilities. Not only is he continuing to be an administrator of his father's vast estate, but his sister-in-law, then the sister of his wife, Lucy, Polly Cobb, loses her husband in a horrible accident on Lake Ontario, and Martin takes into his house Polly and her children. Martin is also eyeing the Erie Canal, and he sees the possibility that crops and small animals on his own properties now, that he'll be able to send crops, small animals down the Erie Canal and make some bigger money in the east. Martin also enjoys weaving, and we find that he enters contests in the county and he wins prizes. He wins money for his ability to weave. Martin also joins with others in a big effort as the Greeks are fighting the Turks over there in Europe. And for Martin and others in Palmyra, they want to send money to the Greeks so that they will not be conquered by Turkey. During this time, he builds a 1.5-story home. Of course, he doesn't build it himself, but his feeling is he's got his own family, and now he's got Polly Cobb and her children. And so he builds what would be a showplace. In other words, the envy of most neighbors who couldn't afford such a dwelling at that time. And you'd say he's almost through with the building. He just has a little bit of walling up to do in the basement, and he wants at least one well and perhaps 2 dug on his property. And so he hires men that he views as common laborers, Joseph Smith Sr. and Hiram Smith. Now, as they're working, I don't know how much time they had to work because Martin has heard rumors of young Joseph Smith and of an angel and of Joseph seeing gold plates. And so as father and son would come to work at the Martin home, you'd say Martin would be there with questions and wanting to know more about the rumors. At first, the Smiths refused to bring Martin into their confidence, but finally Father Smith did, which makes Martin then the first outside of the Smith family that we know of to know about the ancient Moroni and the gold plates and to be brought into that confidence by the Smiths. Well, that for Martin, you'd say suddenly whether the Greeks or the Turks win in the war, he doesn't care. Whether the Erie Canal gets finished, he doesn't care. Whether this or that or whatever is going on, suddenly Martin is absorbed with what he has learned. I mean, it's just kind of like taken over his life. Now, at this point, this becomes a great source of contention between Martin and his wife. Notice Martin and Lucy, as far as we can tell, there's never an official divorce. But for Lucy, she becomes very concerned about her financial stability as things are going on, and Martin's now neglecting responsibilities that normally took up so much of his time. For Lucy, she insists that Martin give her a separate house on his property, which was already there, along with 80 acres. And so you begin to see amidst this marital discourse that Lucy Harris now becomes a woman of means. And it's most unusual at that time because a woman to have a private purse meant she had an independent voice. And Lucy, a woman by this point hard of hearing and suspicious that people were talking about her when indeed they were not, now has a house and 80 acres. She does not immediately move into it. At one point, she attempts literally to try and embrace what Martin has embraced as it relates to young Joseph Smith. So in September of 1827, Lucy Harris is actually the very first person to give Joseph Smith any money for the translation and ultimately publication of the Book of Mormon. So Lucy's gift was $28, and Joseph Smith took it. But you'd say when Martin begins to financially give Joseph money, Lucy cannot accept that. So you'd say we know that Martin will buy Joseph a suit of clothes right there on Main Street in Palmyra, a coat. He doesn't think somebody who's going to be like a preacher should wear these old clothes like Joseph had. At one point, he gives Joseph $50 to help Joseph as he's now going to move from Palmyra to Harmony, Pennsylvania. Another time, it is known that Martin insists that before Joseph moves, that his debts will be paid, and Martin picks those up. So what you've got is a wife that shows some interest in Joseph, giving the first money, but when her husband seems to have an open purse, Lucy is becoming more and more angry. Adding to it, we know that Martin becomes a scribe for Joseph, and scribes then, as Joseph dictates, the Book of Lehi, and then subsequently will lose that manuscript. We also know that Lucy becomes the very first woman, in other words, Lucy Harris, to take Joseph Smith to court. Martin will testify at that court that Joseph isn't just out to get his money. And Martin actually says in that court proceeding that if Joseph has all if Joseph wants all that Martin has, that Martin will give it to him. The result is because of the interconnection between Joseph and Martin Harris, and Lucy angry with this, ultimately they will end up in separate rooms, and ultimately they will then be separated as Martin moves on to Kirtland, and Lucy stays behind. Now, Martin Harris, for years, has been known as the man that lost 116 pages. And what are we talking about? We're talking about the Book of Lehi. We're talking about Joseph translating, Martin scribing. We know that this is the first scripture of the Restoration, and today it has still not been found. For Martin, he made a covenant with Joseph that he could take the pages home and he could show 5 individuals. One individual was to be Lucy, his wife. In other words, he needed help to try and save this marriage. Another was he could show his mother and father, Nathan and Rhoda Harris. and with the idea, hey, Dad, in other words, I know I've neglected your property I've taken care of for years. I want to show you why. He could also show then Preserved Harris, one of his brothers, and then Polly Cobb, Lucy's sister that lives in the house. Now, the result will be is that Martin will have the pages for 3 weeks, literally in his possession somewhere in Palmyra. But at the end of 3 weeks, when Joseph comes to town and asks Hiram, go get Martin, the Smith family will wait at their breakfast table. 8, 9, 10, 11, Martin is not there. By 12, they can see him sitting out on the fence of their frames farmhouse. And then when Martin comes in, he sits down to eat. His hand is shaking. His fork, he can hardly hold it. And Hiram Smith asks, what is the matter? And Martin will indicate it is lost. Suddenly Joseph jumps up. Martin, have you lost the manuscript? When Martin says yes, Joseph says, you have not only lost your soul, but mine. So these are very, very difficult days. Joseph will describe in a front piece of the Book of Mormon that he exerted every effort to try and find the pages, but was unsuccessful in doing so. What I think is absolutely remarkable is that after they are lost, Martin is still selected to be one of the 3 witnesses of the Book of Mormon. And you'd say that just is amazing to me, that he could be involved in something as egregious as the loss of the first scriptures of the Restoration. And yet the Lord is so forgiving that Martin will be chosen along with David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery to be able to witness then an angel from the Lord and to witness the plates. For Martin Harris, when you look at the Book of Mormon, whatever you might say about Martin, nobody can take away the fact that he was the one that financed that original publication there of the Book of Mormon at the Grandin Press. But for Martin Harris, he's got some odd things going on, and you may have picked up some of them already. But one of them is that Martin claims that he starts receiving prophecies from the Lord. And such prophecies as the world will end in 15 years, there won't be a president in these United States, sitting in the presidential office, and things that will happen in Palmyra. And very, very difficult when Martin kind of oversteps his bounds. Well, what can we say that we know of as Martin Harris as a follower of Christ? When the church was organized on April 6, 1830, who was baptized on that day? And it's Martin Harris. So Joseph Smith Sr., Lucy Mack Smith, baptized, and so is Martin Harris. We know that Martin Harris, when he leaves Palmyra, he takes with him a large group and is responsible for them all the way to Kirtland. We know that Martin Harris was beloved enough by the Lord that he was ordained one of the first high priests in this dispensation. We know that he finally makes good on his debt to Grandin, so that Book of Mormon and obligations made with that publications will all be satisfied. We also know that when Martin goes to Missouri, and Joseph indicates that money is needed to be able to buy then lands in Missouri that will ultimately be lands of inheritance and the temple site, that Martin Harris is the first man to give money for that kind of joint project and gives $1,200. I think we could show, if we kept going, that there was no question Martin Harris was a follower of Christ. He was selected to serve on the first High Council of the church. When it came time for volunteers to Zion's camp, Martin was one of the first and took 2 wagons, became a wagoneer on that camp. And when it was time, where they were having a reunion of those that had served in Zion's camp. And it's February 14th, 1835. It's time to select the original quorum of the 12 apostles. The 3 witnesses, which included Martin, will select then the quorum of the 12. And Martin Harris will actually be voice to the blessing given to Heber C. Kimball. So what we know about Martin thus far is that he has sacrificed much, including his wife, his family, for the gospel of Jesus Christ. He's given money, such as money needed for publishing the Book of Mormon, purchasing lands of inheritance. He's given his time, the High Council, and to Zion's camp, and all looks well until the pendulum swings. Now, you wonder, what can happen to Martin? What can happen to us as we move ourselves forward with our testimony? What's going to cause Martin to kind of fall apart? And you begin to see it when Joseph Smith corrects him on these kind of far-out prophecies that Martin is making. In other words, he says, "You're too quick, Martin, you're off." Then another thing happens. Things kind of happen in threes. His brother, Preserved, loses his membership in the church as an excommunicated. And then in the summer of 36, he learns that his wife, Lucy, has died in Palmyra. What's kind of causing the shaking of Martin's testimony? One, correction by a prophet of God. His closest brother loses his membership, and his wife dies. Well, for Martin, he's not one to stand still. He's going to move into action. By this point, we're 1837, and in 1837, literally within the year and less than that, he will remarry. At the time he remarries, he's 53 years old, and remarries a woman named Carolyn Young, who is a niece of Brigham Young. For Carolyn, she's 20. So there's his first wife. He's had a 9-year difference in age of marriage, and now his second wife, 33 years. And for Caroline, it is reported that she literally thought she would never have an opportunity to marry, that there was a birthmark, something on her face that she thought would prevent that. And to marry Martin Harris, wow, a man who had financed the Book of Mormon on the High Council, been in Zion's camp, helped select the original quorum of the 12, and apostles meaning one that is sent. She agrees and becomes the mother of 4 children. But then in 1837, there was the Kirtland Safety Society. The Kirtland Safety Society was the final kicker that moves Martin away from Joseph. Apparently, in this society, there was 205 shareholders, most of them Latter-day Saints. Who is the holdout that will not join the Kirtland Safety Society? And it's Martin Harris. Joseph will come to Martin and say he wants him to join. Well, sure, Martin has money. Not all of the shareholders did. Martin continues to be a rich man. So Joseph comes to him. Sidney Rigdon comes to him and says, be a shareholder. Put your money in the Kirtland Safety Society. Martin refuses. And the reason is that he believed that a safety society bank needed to be based on hard metal, such as gold and silver, not just paper dollars that were printed. As Joseph keeps coming back and wants Martin to invest, Martin literally does something that, kind of angers the prophet. Instead of investing in the Kirtland Society, Martin turns around and puts in over $5,000 in land in Kirtland. In other words, land you still have, paper money can burn up. When in November of 1837, when the bank closed its doors and the average investor and shareholder received back 12.5 cents for every dollar that they had put in the Kirtland Safety Society, Martin now believes that he is smarter than the prophet Joseph and that he was right. In other words, he has such financial ability that if Joseph had had the same ability, the bank would not have had to close its doors. The result will be is that there is a huge break between Joseph and Martin Harris. Some accounts will say that Martin was excommunicated in December 1837. Other accounts will say no, he was just dropped from the High Council. They didn't want him anymore to serve on the Kirtland High Council. Whatever it was, the saints will move on out of Kirtland. For Martin, he stays there. As he stays there, he begins to join many different religions. His first is 1838 with Warren Parrish. With Warren Parrish, he becomes a member of his High Council. Surprising thought. And Warren Parrish and his group takes over the Kirtland Temple. In 41, he's no longer sustained as a high priest. But by 42, he's rebaptized in the church. It doesn't last long. He eventually joins with the Shakers, but his most interesting religious affiliation was with James Strang. Martin actually served a mission for James Strang to the British Isles. In other words, to the homelands of his ancestors. And you can imagine this caused great confusion in the British Isles because you would have the Latter-day Saint missionaries sharing the Book of Mormon, turning to the testimony of the three witnesses, and Martin then saying, but I am one of the witnesses, joined with the Strangite movement. Well, he was with Strangite, became disillusioned, and by 47, he's joined with William McClellan. He's kind of in and out, and by 52, a reporter comes to Kirtland named Reuben Alderman. And Reuben Alderman writes that he got Martin in like a hotel away from everyone, that Martin was drinking, and that he told Reuben that his testimony in the Book of Mormon was not true. Now, that went everywhere. And you realize the Lord needs to save and protect his witnesses. And so in 1853, coming to Kirtland, was an elder that was on his way to England named David Dilley. And as David Dilley now shows up in Kirtland, he goes to see Martin. And he wants to hear Martin's testimony. And David will write back to family and leaders in the church. Martin is true to that testimony. And Martin is talking about he'd like to go west. Well, Martin doesn't go west, but eventually he's willing to take his wife, Caroline Young Harris, all the way out to Iowa, a place called Rocky Ford, where the saints were living in 103 little communities along the Missouri River. He takes Carolyn out there, but when she decides she's going to go all the way to the Rockies, Martin returns to Kirtland. So Carolyn goes west. There's no official divorce from Martin, but she does marry another man named John Davis, and is divorced 7 years later, and she moves up to Smithfield, Utah. In the meantime, we look back at Martin. Martin's found another church to join. It's a church that was organized by William Smith, Joseph Smith's brother. He doesn't stay with that one long, but when it comes to the 1860 census, when Martin lists his occupation, he says he's a Mormon preacher, and he's a guide to the Kirtland Temple. So in the 1860s, if you wanted to go to the Kirtland Temple, who would lead you through, and you'd see the beautiful altars and the ceiling and so much, it would always be Martin Harris. He had the key. When does Martin finally go west? Well, it's 30-plus years after 1837, right? In 1869, William Homer comes to town, and William says that he tells Martin, "My sister has married your son. Would you like to see him out there?" And Martin indicates, yeah, he'd like to come out to Utah to see his family, but he doesn't want to stay, and he wants a round trip, and he wants somebody else to pay for it. Why does he want somebody else to pay for it? And the answer is Martin is now extremely poor. He has lived with his son for a while after Carolyn heads west. Then there are neighbors in town that take him inside. There's talk of Martin having to go to the poorhouse. And so you'd say, "Martin, what happened to your wealth?" And he just couldn't hold on to it. It wasn't until 1870 that Edward Stevenson came to see Martin Harris. Now, of all those that visited Martin, I really liked this man. And he came and he asked Martin if he'd like to come west, and Martin said yes. And Edward Stevenson, when he gets home, he goes to see Brigham Young. And, just that in of itself takes courage. And he goes to see Brigham, and he says to Brigham, he said, "I've spoken with Martin, and he's willing to come to Utah." Now, notice, if you were to look at the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses, Martin is the only witness of the Book of Mormon that actually comes to Utah. When Brigham Young hears this, he indicates that he's never heard a better thing in his entire life, and he said, "Send for Martin by all means." And he said, "He will be here in time." Now, Edward Stevenson begins a subscription among Latter-day Saints to bring Martin to Utah. Brigham Young gives one of the biggest donations, $25. When Edward Stevenson has $200, he gets on a train and he heads to Kirtland, Ohio, to find Martin Harris and to bring him to Utah. When he's got Martin Harris, notice he's 88. He's seen him. He's come back for him right away. Martin Harris, by this point, has no teeth. And he looks poor. Edward gets him on a train. They get out to Iowa. Martin speaks to some of the saints in Iowa. The saints in Iowa see how he looks. They take up a collection so they can buy Martin Harris's suit so he can go to Salt Lake City in style. As Martin now comes to Salt Lake City, there's so many stories. One, he's in Salt Lake City for 6 weeks. At one point, he's on a peak overlooking the city, and he looks down on the city. He can see the temple starting. He can see that whole temple square, how gorgeous it is. He sees houses, and his comment was, "Who would have guessed the Book of Mormon could have done all of this?" He will speak in many locations. At one point, he's in the Salt Lake 14th Ward, and the Relief Society president comes up and says, "I have money for the poor. I'd like to give it to you so that you can have teeth." And Martin says, no. He goes, "I won't live that long enough. Give it to the poor." Martin will speak in the tabernacle, and it will be said of him, he's been asleep for a long time. Now, I don't know, 30 years out of the church, plus that's a long time. Martin Harris will be rebaptized, and he will be baptized in what you see here, the endowment house that's no longer on Temple Square. He will be baptized on September 17th, 1870. He will see that the baptism work is done for his father. Okay, do you see what I'm talking about? Different ancestors. Martin Harris will be endowed, and after 6 weeks, 88 years old, he just wants to be with his family. Martin Harris, now a new suit. He heads out to Smithville, Utah. He will stay with his son, Martin Harris Jr. He will be a very sought-after, not speaker, but someone where you'd say you want to come to see him, to have him bear his witness of the Book of Mormon. Youth groups will come, neighbors will come, people will come as far away as Wellsville to come and hear the witness to the Book of Mormon. Martin never changes his testimony as to the truth. Finally, the last 10 months of his life, he will move to a place very close. It's called pasture land, next to Smithfield, named Clarkston, Utah. He will be there for 10 months. He's no longer walking the streets like he did in Smithfield. He's pretty much confined to his home. As people come to see him, he's anxious if they just can hear one thing, and it's his witness of the Book of Mormon. Well, when Martin dies at age 92, there will, of course, be a funeral service. As his casket is brought into the ward house there, Martin Harris Jr. will run forward and say, stop the funeral service. He says, I need to go get something. He will go home and he will get a Book of Mormon and a Doctrine and Covenants. Martin, in years past, had given money for the paper to be used to be able to print the Doctrine and Covenants. When Martin Harris Jr. comes back, he will put a Book of Mormon in Martin's right hand and the Doctrine and Covenants in his left hand, and he will say, now the funeral can continue. Well, Clarkston, Utah, there is a beautiful monument to Martin Harris right there in the Homer part of the graveyard there in Clarkston, Utah. At one point, an overzealous mayor and council people from Logan concluded that they could improve tourism in Logan if they were to dig up the body of Martin Harris and bring him to Logan and put him on a corner there of the Logan Temple site. And so the mayor, who is also stake president, comes to Clarkston and is telling the community they want to dig up Martin and take him to Logan. We're increasing tourism. Meantime, the local bishop has some of the young boys go out and slash the tires of the mayor / stake president and his council, because there was no way they were going to give up their choice son, Martin Harris. Now, in conclusion, Martin Harris was faithful for a time, and then maybe like a revolving doors that we've all been in. He's in the church. When he's in, he's just powerful. He's wonderful. He's giving his all. And then he's out. And for him, he's out a really long time. And it's as if he had been asleep. And I think the favorite line of all lines that we have preserved of what Martin said to me was his coming into Utah and saying, who would have guessed the Book of Mormon could have done all of this? Well, the Book of Mormon has done all of that in Salt Lake, in Martin's mind, and perhaps mine. And you look throughout the world, and the Book of Mormon is carried by these marvelous missionaries and members throughout the world to tell the people that Jesus is the Christ. I am very grateful for Martin Harris. I'm grateful for Edward Stevenson, who didn't just suggest you come to Utah, but made a huge effort to bring him. And I like the fact that sometimes when we've made mistakes, we actually need somebody that comes back, rescues us, pulls us, and then goes with us to make sure that we succeed and we're in the right place at the right time. I say this humbly in Jesus' name. Amen.